which is a lot.
And therefore, I think what a lot of the 6G research, and this is interesting actually, because these guys saying 5G is just about pushing it up into the sort of mid-band range, 3.5. Whereas a lot of the 6G research is actually talking about pushing it into terahertz spectrum.
Right.
That's where a lot of the research is going.
Blimey. Which has obviously got even shorter range and propagation characteristics.
I mean, obviously with that, you're not going to be building wide area networks, but...
No. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. Just me and Ian this week. But it was really good fun chatting to... and of course Peter, sorry, my bad.
The other guy, as he gets referred
just me and Ian and Francois over there. And it was great chatting to Maria last week about all that. It's such a massive topic, all that blockchain, decentralized, metaverse, all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
We're going to do a bit of metaverse at the end, but it won't be as in the weeds as it was with Maria. But thanks again to you, Maria, if you're listening to this one. It's probably not. She's like, all right, I've done my bit now. I'm not going to listen to that bullshit
do
anymore.
Some proper work now.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to fix some stuff. Thank God there is a market for people to just talk shit.
Yeah, rather than get the screwdriver out.
Otherwise, what would we do? So what's going on? I still got a dodgy ankle. I don't know what's going on. I don't even remember twisting my ankle. It's not like
Maybe it's your shoes.
No, I don't think so. I think get to my age and you just get these little soft tissue injuries, and they just hang around for a little while. So I'm feeling a bit sorry for myself, and it's basically given me an excuse to have a fairly healthy nightcap pretty much every night this week. So I might have to take next week off, just give my liver a break.
That's what I'm doing.
Then again. So not that much else to chat about, so I'll just crack on with it. Well, I've got to remember to do my little thing. Actually, I got a pat on the back for remembering to do the call to action for the newsletter last week from Emma, who apparently does listen. Because I said no one from marketing listens. Well, Emma does. So hello, Emma. Shout out. And I'll try. Now I'll probably forget in a minute, but still. Okay, what are we going to talk about? It's been a bit dead, hasn't it, news-wise?
It's been a really quiet week. Easter, isn't it?
Yeah, I always say that's when journalists earn their money, is quiet news, where you got to do some turd polishing.
Yeah.
So we're probably going to be chatting more about stuff that we just enjoyed writing or find interesting, rather than stories that necessarily scored a home run. And I think the thing we're going to start talking about is, we've mentioned it a couple of times just sort of organically on the pod in passing when we've been chatting about other things, and we've actually had a couple of people give us feedback. One was on a comment on a pod from 2 weeks ago, so I can name check that person. Another was from someone who wants to remain anonymous, but I'll certainly say some of what they emailed me. Basically these are people who seem to know what they're talking about, and they've given us some further input on 5G new radio and whether it's very new at all.
Yeah.
So we'll do that. And then you wrote a piece that caught my eye this week, where mainly because it's, again, a bit like what we're talking about with this new radio, another thing that I haven't heard many people in the industry talk about. And I actually think that's a big part of what proper journalism is just bringing shit up that isn't being spoken about, or having Emperor's New Clothes moment where there was something's taken for granted and you suddenly go, hold on a sec, how come? What if it's not that?
Yeah.
And yours was about it seems in the weeds on the surface because it's backhaul, but backhaul's just as important as every other part of the network, obviously. Mm-hmm. We're talking specifically about UK operators who don't have their own sort of extensive fixed line sort of fibre networks, and what they do for backhaul and what.
Although I think it's a bigger issue than just the UK.
Okay, fair enough.
I mean,
but was your story just UK?
It is actually just a UK story. But when I last read about backhaul a few years ago, there was a European angle to it definitely as well. There was a lot of concern in other European markets at the time. So I just need to look into where that's at, kind of thing, which I didn't do for this one.
Okay, yeah, well, we'll follow whatever tangents that takes us on. And then the last one, I think we can talk about, partly inspired by a conversation with Maria last week, is Metaverse. Andrew wrote a story that we just put up this morning where Lego of plastic bricks that stick in your feet fame, and Epic Games of Fortnite fame, among other things, have got together and decided they're going to make a metaverse for kids. And I just think a moment like that, and they could do it really well, because those sort of things sort of exist in their infancy. You could argue Fortnite or any open world is a bit like that, or Minecraft or Roblox, or all these things that those of us with kids of varying ages, I suppose yours are a bit young for them to have got into stuff like that, but I tell you, it won't be far away.
You'll be spending your evenings making big sort of princess castles, looking for that final bit in the box.
That's so sexist. Why can't they play with action men? How dare you put them in a gender box like that?
You're going to get people writing in now.
But who are they going to complain about? Are they going to complain about you or my Saki rebuke? It's just like, oh, both of you are bastards. But anyway,
I guess I won't say anything.
Yeah, we need to have one person who's not in the shit. But anyway, we're going to talk about that, and I just think it raises sort of societal, ethical, general considerations. So that's what we'll do, and I will remind you that if you're watching this on the site or on YouTube or on Facebook, you can also listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and loads of other podcasting platforms. And if you think we're interesting, do you know, I should give you a call to action. It's only fair. It shouldn't just be Telecoms.com. If you're interested in what we say, you can subscribe to the Telecoms.com newsletter on the site, or you can subscribe to the Light Reading newsletter, which seems only fair because that's where you'll get Ian's stuff. He never writes to Telecoms.com. We're beneath him.
No, I'm not allowed to.
I don't pay you any money. So I think that's covered everything, and Emma should be happy. So I'm happy. If Emma's happy, I'm happy. Cool. Right, let's crack on with the first topic then. I'm going to just fire up some correspondence I've had from people. Firstly, I'm going to just fire up from the person I'm not going to name because they asked not to be named.
He who shall not be named.
Yeah,
He's
but
like,
you can guess which part of the world they're from because their email opened "Good day, Scott." So that narrows it down a little bit, doesn't it? That's as far as I'm going to go. Anonymous correspondence. Don't worry. He's sort of listening and going, "You bloody bastard."
He's narrowed it down too much.
Now here to fuck spiders.
And it's not Ian Hood from Babel. Or Norel for that matter.
It's someone who does actual things like.
Well, quite. So this person does things and seems to know what they're talking about, and he said. Listen to the most recent pod and one few weeks before that. You guys were talking about LTE versus 5G throughput. And put the call out for vendors or press folks to get in touch to clarify if LTE and 5G are both using OFDM. What's that stand for?
Orthogonal Frequency Division Multiplexing.
Go on, son. And what's the difference in speed all about? Anyway, it's a fairly lengthy, detailed email, but the long and short of it is he basically. So our point was, we understand that 5G is using higher frequencies, and the real utility of higher frequencies isn't anything intrinsic to them. It's just that there's lots of it, partly because it's a bit shitter for radio transmission in terms of propagation and range and all that sort of thing. So what we really want is something around about 1,000 megahertz, 1 gigahertz. That's really good. Once you get up into sort of 3+, it starts to deteriorate, and you get into millimetre wave. And our joke is always you've got to be sitting on a base station in order to receive it. And so if you strip out the fact that 5G is basically able to do what we call, we started calling it carrier aggregation back in the day. Now we call it more sort of MIMO and massive MIMO, but basically creating lots and lots of parallel streams. So a typical.
I think they're separate things, carrier aggregation and massive.
Are they? Okay, well,
I think so.
I'll get you to clarify that if you've got a clear idea of that in a sec, because I sort of conflate the two because I don't know any better. But, basically a normal single sort of mobile phone transmission uses up about 5 megahertz of frequency, doesn't it?
Yep.
And so it stands to reason that if you do 2 of them, i.e. use up 10 megahertz of frequency, you can get double the throughput. It's probably not quite as analogous to that, but for the purpose of this, you get double. And then if you can use 20 megahertz, you get 4 times, and so on and so on. And that's really what, the things that I conflate, carrier aggregation and MIMO, and massive MIMO. And all massive MIMO is bigger MIMO, I presume.
Yeah.
Massive.
It's just wicked MIMO. Or it's the MIMO massive, isn't it?
It is quite a weird name, isn't it? Massive Mimo.
Massive.
It does sound like it's some sort of.
Did you ever used to watch the Day to Day, the news satire? It was from like 20, 30 years ago.
Is that similar to The Thick of It?
Well, I think Armando Iannucci was possibly a writer of both, but it had Chris
Peter
Morris.
Capaldi, is he involved?
No, Peter Capaldi wasn't it? But it had Chris Morris being the newsreader who's had a sort of Jeremy Paxman sort of pushy bastard vibe about him.
Yeah.
And it was one of the first times I ever saw Steve Coogan as in his Alan Partridge guides and all that sort of thing. Anyway, there's just one I always remember. And this is a real Armando Iannucci typical thing. They had Alan Partridge doing horse racing, and the joke with Alan Partridge's character was always that he's a complete dilettante. He didn't know shit about sport. And
that was a goal.
Yeah. Yeah, there was one bit of sports commentary where someone scored like a really long shot, and he just went, "Shit!"
He must have a foot like a tractor engine.
Yeah. So you know all those clips. And then anyway, there was one bit where he was doing horse.
Another one.
And of course, he was always really rude and objectionable to people. He was doing horse racing and just basically asking the jockeys what it's like to be so small and stuff like that. And then there was one time, I don't know if you I mean, it probably wouldn't apply to you, Pierre, but when I was a kid and there was fuck all on telly on Sunday, you sometimes end up watching horse racing just because it's better than not watching telly.
Yeah, for me, it was Formula 1.
It's back in the days of 3 channels.
Yeah, exactly. And it always seemed, apart from the fact that the race itself always seemed quite boring, there'd just be this endless dicking about in advance with, they're going, "Oh, that horse, she's a frisky filly," or whatever. all this parlance that doesn't mean anything normal. Anyway, cut a long story short, this is a completely irrelevant tangent, but it's quite funny. They were once reading out the names of the horses. The horses have always got these weird like names.
Yeah.
And so Alan Partridge was reading out these names of the horses, and and there's all these obscure ones, and one of the horses was just called Massive Bereavement. And I just thought those two words together, Massive Bereavement, it's so Armando Iannucci. I just thought, how could you have bereavement that's massive? So
Massive bereavement.
Yeah, I know. God, one day, have you ever heard the Peter Cook and Dudley Moore horse racing commentary?
No.
Oh shit! If we got time after, I'll play it. You will absolutely piss yourself. It's just pure schoolboy humour. All the horses are called like Big Tits and the Prick and that sort of thing, and Peter Cook just narrates the whole thing. Anyway. So sorry everyone, that's got nothing to do with telecoms. Completely unprofessional.
Shall we wrap it up?
Yeah.
Let's go down the pub.
So that's Massive Mimo tangent. Getting back to the point. So
wait. Actually, Massive Mimo Tangent. That's a good name for a horse.
Yeah, or a band. Yeah. The point we were musing, and to which we've got this feedback on, is if you just had, let's say, over a 9 megahertz spectrum, and you're using 5 megahertz of spectrum, which the terminology can get confusing, and you used LTE technology, or you use 5G new radio, would it be any faster on 5G new radio?
In the same band?
Yeah, in the same band.
With everything
being equal.
Same,
everything being absolutely equal. So just the technology.
And he gave some data.
Yeah, and he actually gave some data. He was talking about 5 megahertz of bandwidth in... I don't think he necessarily picked a band. But he said 5 megahertz, and he goes, operating in 4x4 MIMO, 256 QAM. Do you know what that stands for?
No,
but that's a thing.
I should do. It's something to do with modulation, I think.
Yeah. In LTE mode, gets you 102 megabits per second, and the same thing in 5G NR mode gets you 108 megabits per second. So we're looking at 5% difference max.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty minuscule difference.
Yeah. And so that's what this person said.
I mean, that was the thing that really leapt out when you showed it to me.
Yeah.
Was that bit, because it was, when we've asked other people about it, they've gone, "Oh, I'm not sure. It's probably not that different." But there's someone who, and this guy, who I don't know who he is, by the way, because you haven't told me, but that's fine, you shouldn't. But he's obviously he's a credible source, it looks like, from just the way he's written his email.
I think you just pulled random acronyms like that out of your arse
with
and
actually building networks, so doing this stuff. So,
I find it credible. It's still just one person's point of view, and other people, just as, I mean, the reason people are responding is, as we kind of said on the pod, if anyone knows any better, then let us know. So I'm grateful that people listen and feel moved to respond. So that's one person. We've chatted to other people. We've chatted to like analyst friends, and they've been like, they haven't necessarily 100% endorsed our position, but they've struggled to prove that 5G NR is in and of itself a superior technology when it comes to throughput.
Yeah.
And then this other person who I can mention, because they made a comment on the pod we did 2 weeks ago, calls himself Satellite Guy. He starts by going, Satellite Guy here, enjoy the show mainly for the banter. So that's good. That permits me to go off and talk shit, doesn't it? If only to please Satellite Guy. And of course, for some wider telecoms news, keep up the good work, gentlemen. So hurrah for that. We like Satellite Guy. And anyway, he's a fairly long comment, and anyone can see it if they follow Emma's call to action and click through and subscribe to the newsletter and go on the site. They can see it. It's the pod called Russia, T-Mobile US, and Nothing. And I'm not going to read his whole thing because he wrote a fair bit, but long and short of it is he also said that. Like his final paragraph, 5G on the air interface side, this is quoting him, is mainly about bringing in support for some new frequencies, channel sizes and antenna technologies. And then he goes on to say these are not gains that can be achieved cheaply for manufacturers or operators. More spectrum, larger channels equals more money to government. More small cells equals more sites need to be deployed. And we chatted to an operator this week about the small cell cost of rolling out 5G, and they kind of downplayed it, but they didn't convince me, if I'm honest. The fact is if you're doing most of your 5G over mid-band, like 3.5 gigahertz, you're going to have to surely, and this person was sort of insisting that it can mainly be done through existing macro cell inventory, weren't they?
Yeah, and I find that, I do find that a bit sort of hard to swallow, and I mean, the weird. It's funny because if you talk, I mean, go on a record with these guys because they've talked about it in public discussions. But Orange has sort of downplayed the need for a lot of densification, they call it. Putting in new sites, saying that they can, you're getting onto things like massive MIMO. I mean, their implication is that they can overcome some of those propagation challenges with better beamforming technologies and this sort of thing. But
I've heard that, and it may be true.
Well, I don't know, because even I've talked to some vendors who were sceptical of that. They're like, well, beamforming doesn't really do that. It sort of gives you that ability to target specific devices and make sure you get a really good sort of signal to that device. You
have to be very clever to do that.
But it's not about actually extending the cell range or something. And this is the thing, if you're operating a grid that's been built for 1800, let's say, or 2.1, which were the sort of 2G, 3G, 4G bands, I think a lot of 4G ended up getting done in 1800, didn't it, actually, even though the spectrum that was awarded was 2.6 and whatever.
Isn't that what E refarmed?
Yeah, they refarmed. So the point is that they're a lot lower than 3.5, 3.6, whatever it might be, and therefore you're going to get some sort of cell edge issues. And I think that's one of the reasons why in Europe, certainly, where you don't have very dense networks, unlike say in South Korea where you do, there's been a lot of use of things like DSS, which is sharing lower band spectrum between 4G and 5G to get the coverage. But then there's a big complaint.
That's dynamic spectrum sharing.
There's a big complaint that because they've done that and because they have this grid that they have, the mid-band coverage isn't actually that great. You know? And they're all quite wary of saying what mid-band coverage is. But Ericsson came out with some data. I remember writing a story about this a year ago, maybe. And with Ericsson basically complaining that mid-band coverage is really pretty appalling. I mean, they're obviously, it's a bit self-serving because they want to sell more mid-band radios, but
more small cells.
The trouble is, if you don't have the grid there and you haven't densified enough, then it's not just about buying the radio. You've got to kind of get new site infrastructure that you can use.
Well,
and that's expensive.
One other bit of pushback we had with this operator we were chatting to was to say that the densification, things are already dense enough in urban environments like London, which may or may not be true. I mean, I'm not saying they're lying, but I'm saying I believe that they believe that. Whether that turns out to be the case in practice and whether when it comes down to it, in order to get the kind of blanket coverage of 5G over mid-band spectrum that they want, whether or not they're going to have to roll out a fuckload of small cells to augment.
Well, do you know what? I think it's not a problem now, but and then this is getting onto the stuff we might talk about later on, Metaverse and all this kind of thing. I mean, Ericsson did this really interesting presentation where they were saying, if you look at if some of this stuff does happen to do with VR and the Metaverse and some of these these applications that everybody wants to come along that you need super capable networks for and really good quality coverage, and you kind of, your very sort of basic flavour of 5G based on lower band spectrum just isn't going to cut it, then all of a sudden then you're potentially you've got a bit of a situation on your hands. And if it comes along quicker than we expect it to, then countries like South Korea and China, where densification is very good, and I think maybe even Japan, look a lot better off then than a lot of Europe, for instance, or even the US. I don't think densification is very good in the US either, actually. Maybe even worse.
And we're presumably, when you say densification, you're talking specifically within urban settings. No one's expecting.
Well, it's not even really me sort of drilling down and looking at an urban setting because people live in, and it depends what kind of population you've got. I mean, what's an urban setting somewhere like the Netherlands?
But I mean, for example, South Korea, my understanding is the data on South Korea is, their 5G population coverage is good. Yeah. But that's partly because everyone lives in Seoul.
Yeah, but if you look at the whole of South Korea and you work out how many base stations there are per person,
it's still
or
really
per 100,000 people, or whatever it is, it's the ratio's like there's a lot of base stations basically.
Fair enough.
And each base station's not supporting a huge number of people effectively if you work it out on that basis.
Right.
Whereas in markets like the UK and Germany, it's the opposite.
We've still been a bit tight with them.
It's just a massive gap. I remember doing it in that story where I chatted to Ericsson. I can't remember the figures off the top of my head. I wish I could, but it's a huge difference. It's a huge difference, and I don't. I mean, or urban. If you drill it down and you look at it in a more sort of granular way, and maybe London is okay. I don't know. I've not. It's harder to do that really because you'd have to get specific data from the operators to be able to do those sorts of calculations, and they don't tend to give that out. Maybe it's not as bad. I don't know, but. It just doesn't look good at a national level. Put it like that.
Yeah, I'm just not buying it. I can see why an operator might think, we've got enough to at least get the ball rolling in urban places.
Yeah,
and I can see why they certainly wouldn't want to admit to a journalist that this is going to be an issue in future, because they don't necessarily give a shit what we say, but if through us we're signalling to the investment market that they've got a big capex situation heading up, then that can lead to fucking aggro, can't it?
I mean, I think the stuff you're saying and the comments you've got on this new radio issue, it just more and more makes me think. I suppose people defending 5G would say, well, hang on a minute, it's not just about the air interface, and actually the speed of it all, the speed of download and all this kind of stuff was maybe not the most important thing. It's more about capacity and getting those higher spectrum bands, as well as some of the stuff that we haven't seen yet because it's coming along in the next flavour of 5G, the standalone, which a lot of people are now sort of saying is real 5G, things like network slicing and everything. But the trouble for me with that argument is, one, we haven't seen those applications yet. We haven't seen network slicing really being sort of used to do stuff commercially at scale.
People sort of teasing it. I think we spoke a few weeks ago about that Ericsson app that allows you to sort of hike up your bandwidth.
And there's a lot of scepticism about it. You talk to people like Dean Bubley, he's incredibly sceptical about network slicing and whether there's a need for it. And he's not alone. I think there's a lot of analysts questioning whether any of this stuff really has widespread appeal or if there's a need for it kind of thing. And then you're talking about several years now of 5G being around where it has actually all been about new radio and it's been sold and promoted heavily and marketed the hell out of. Companies have paid huge amounts of money for their spectrum. Consumers have been sold this technology because that's the only thing, frankly, that operators know how to do is to sort of slap a 5G label on a bus that's going past and expect you to go and get a new phone on the basis of it, and yet there's not really a big difference. We're being told by these guys, and it's remarkable actually how their comments are really, really similar,
really coincide,
and they're both basically said you could pretty much do the same stuff that they're doing with all you need to do is have the 4G like kind of equipment community engineer stuff for those higher.
Yeah, well, I think one of the
bands,
points one of the commenters made was that it's just that some of that MIMO stuff wasn't in the 4G standard.
Yeah.
But it's not something, and I'll refer back to you here because you've got a better knowledge of the technological change between 3G and 4G. So I started covering this sector in 2014 when 4G was sort of mainly.
Well, I wouldn't rely on me to be.
No, I'm not looking for you to get technically into the weeds, but when we were chatting before, you pointed out that there was a clear air interface change in technology between 3G. Is that what you said? Am I putting the wrong words in your mouth?
I think the OFDM stuff, which these guys have both said is the underlying sort of thing that you've got in 4G and 5G.
We didn't have that at 3G.
I think 3G is different from that. I think it was, in fact, 3G, the sort of technologies that were being used were more apparent. They even used to be a bit of sort of marketing on that basis. Instead of calling it LTE and NR, which don't sound technical at all, actually, when you spell them out. There was this competition for a while in 3G, if you remember, between CDMA 2000, wideband CDMA. You had China doing SCDMA, and that's
CDMA.
That was the sort of underlying, which is now I'm not a physicist or an air interface specialist, so I wouldn't want to stick my neck out and say that 4G is completely different from 3G, but it was certainly a step-changing capability. One thing I find interesting about this whole it's both OFDM, is that we were told, if you look back at the early stuff, go back to 2015, 2016, when the IT was sort of setting out its vision for what 5G should be, and it had these press releases coming out, and most of the attention in those press releases is actually on the air interface, despite all this stuff about network slicing and it needs to do this, it needs to do that. There was a huge amount of attention on the air interface. That's where the focus is going. And it doesn't really sound like we've got anything dramatically different.
That's what I'll say. Like to succinctly punctuate the point I think we're both making, is I think we're calling bullshit on 5G new radio.
Yeah.
They've called it new radio, and in hindsight, that's a bit suspicious, isn't it? That's almost like FMCG marketing, like new improved aerial, tougher on dirt type of thing. So it's new radio, it's new. Well, what's new about it?
But it isn't new, it seems. Yeah.
But it's almost like it's smoke and mirrors. They're saying it's new.
Do you know there's someone else who would back this up as well, but in a more sort of oblique way, is a guy called Richard Windsor who has a blog
I subscribe to his thing. Yeah.
Radio Free Mobile. He used to be a Nomura analyst actually, and now has his own sort of research company, and he puts out blogs that are written in a sort of bullet point form, quite snappy sort of comments and quite sharp comments about anything from what's going on in China to social networking. But his background's obviously more on the kind of telecom sort of this side of it, and he was, when that whole thing about who owns 5G, who owns all the intellectual property in 5G. You remember there was this discussion going on, we've talked about it on the pod before, who are the big players in who's got most of the patents? Is it Huawei, is it Ericsson, is it Nokia, is it someone else? And there's always this suspicion that Huawei itself is always saying, we're the dominant player in 5G.
Well, they do love to file a patent.
Yeah, we own most of the patents. And then you had quite a lot of reporting, I think, based on this, with people just sort of saying Huawei's emerged as the big force in 5G. And it owns most. Now, Richard Windsor, I remember reading one of his posts where he's very sceptical about this. And the reason he was sceptical was because Huawei never had the same sort of position in 4G. And he specifically wrote, and they're both based on the same underlying OFDM technology. So you would think that if you look at 5G and where a lot of the essential patents come from, they're actually the same. They come from the same pool, and therefore this is one of the reasons I think why Ericsson and Nokia are still so strong, because they had that position already. There
was also I remember covering this a little while back where I felt slightly out of my depth, but I was doing it with like people who forgot more about this. I'd either know, like maybe it was InterDigital, someone like that.
Yeah, well, they don't know a lot about it. Yeah,
and and they were explaining to me the difference between these patents. And so you got standard essential patents, but you've got patents filed, you've got patents approved, you've got patents that have been considered standard essential, patents that are FRAND. It gets very fucking murky.
Yeah.
But basically, it's not difficult for a company, let's say like Huawei, to issue a press release talking about one metric which flatters them.
Yeah.
But which isn't necessarily indicative of the amount of the technology that's standard essential that they provided or something like that.
Totally.
It gets quite murky. And by the way, Huawei, I know, does contribute a lot of proper technology.
It's not really to the reason I'm raising it is not really to sort of dismiss Huawei's claims or say that it was just this point he made.
There's a lot of
that he was curious as to how you could suddenly come from nowhere or not come from nowhere, but suddenly from not having a huge position previously to having a big one now, when the underlying technology, and he specifically called it out, he said OFDM is the same for both of these standards. And it's funny because I do remember when when 5G first came along, when we started writing about it in whenever it might be, 2017, 2018, maybe even before then, when there was sort of, it's getting to sort of 2 years before it's due to be launch stage, and everybody's speculating what it can be still and how it's going to end up. And going around and you're sort of asking people questions about the air interface and what new radio is, and I can never really get a very straight answer out of people. Then people were saying, it's a new air interface, but it's like you try and show a bit more scientific interest, and what it is what is it exactly?
It's like everyone knew,
and it was like people knew, but they just didn't want to tell you.
That's what I mean. It feels like an Emperor's New Clothes moment. It feels like we're going, the Emperor's got no motherfucking clothes on, and everyone's going, no, shut up. He's got an excellent.
Well, and this goes back to I think I mentioned last week, ETSI, the main sort of European standards institute that feeds into the 3GPP. I was chatting with Adrian Scrace, who's the CTO there, in the run up to Mobile World Congress, and he was saying, that one of the reasons you have this sort of push for a new generation is to attract interest and funding from governments and to get attention. But actually, he sort of admitted it himself. In some cases, you're really just sort of going from one release to another release. It's not like
it's not as simple as a step change.
It should be. That's the point, really, with a generational change.
If it's a whole new technology.
But I think with 5G, maybe that step change is, and we don't know yet because it hasn't quite got here, but maybe it's standalone. Yeah, maybe that's the real.
But even that's not going to affect the air interface, though, is it?
No, it isn't. But it doesn't have to be about the air interface.
No,
that's what I'm saying.
I'm not disagreeing with you, but just to some extent draw a line on the air interface side of things. The claim we're making is that the air interface is no significant improvement over what it was before. Yes, there could be in the plumbing all sorts of clever shit going on.
But 6G is not going to be a new air interface either,
isn't it? Do we know that for sure?
Well, Vodafone at their recent press conference said, this was Andrea Donner, said it's looking increasingly likely that it'll be the same air interface as 5G. And Howard Watson told me on camera, we've got it on one of the light reading videos at Mobile World Congress, that it's looking like it's going to be the same air interface. I wrote a story on it about 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Could be that just
6G will not be a new air interface.
So the tech's not there and the physics isn't there. Maybe for the time being.
Well, I think Andrea Donner just said there's nothing new coming out of universities, and what we've got is.
So for the time being, we're extracting the maximum amount of throughput that we can from a given little bit of spectrum,
which is a lot. And therefore, I think what a lot of the 6G research, and this is interesting actually, because these guys saying 5G is just about pushing it up into the sort of mid-band range, 3.5, whereas a lot of the 6G research is actually talking about pushing it into terahertz spectrum.
Right.
That's where a lot of the research is going.
Blimey. Which has obviously got even shorter range and propagation characteristics.
I mean, obviously with that, you're not going to be building wide area networks, but that's where a lot of the research is on using those spectrum bands.
Another thing that made me smell a rat quite early on with 5G new radio, I think it was OpenSignal, came up with some data in the US. So let's say they were just talking about the three. I don't know if the Sprint T-Mobile US merger had completed then, but let's say the three that exist now. And there were 2 data sets they used. They did 5G coverage and they did 5G data rates. And T-Mobile US's 5G coverage was excellent. But that's because they've been refarming 600 megahertz or creating. Maybe it wasn't even refarming. Maybe they got it in an auction or something like that. But anyway, they've got a bunch of this 600, which obviously that's about as low as we go in terms of mobile phone spectrum, isn't it? 600 megahertz. And
I mean, 900 was originally awarded, I think, in this country for 2G, wasn't it?
And so 600 should be even better in terms of range and propagation characteristics, I would have thought, or maybe certainly equal anyway. And so they had the best coverage on 5G, but then you looked at their data rates, and their data rates were basically no better than 4G.
Yeah.
Because there's fuck all 600 kicking about. They were using 5 megahertz channels of 600. So that confirms what we're talking about. And then on the flip side, they had Verizon, which had about 1% or less, maybe 0.1% coverage of 5G, but awesome data rates.
Yeah.
And that's because they've gone heavy on millimeter wave. And so they can get these great big fat pipes through the tons of millimeter wave real estate that there is, but no one can get hold of it.
Yeah.
And so even back then, from my limited technical understanding, I was just like, well, clearly, it's not about the technology itself. It's just about whether or not it's able to create fat pipes through higher frequency spectrum, where there's lots of real estate, where there's lots of spectrum available.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know, unless, if people are listening, they want to keep writing in, either comment on there or send me or Ian emails. But I haven't had a single person, and actually we just a trail on the 22nd, so the pod after the next one, and we'll be shooting the next one a day early because of Easter. We're hoping to have Neil McRae, who we've spoken about on the pod before. In fact, I even did a shit Scottish impression of Neil McRae on the pod. And he obviously... You're
going to do another one.
He obviously wasn't offended by it, because he was like, "Yeah, come on, you bastard." And he... Sorry, Neil. And I won't do it anymore. I certainly won't do it when he's here. That would be out of order, wouldn't it? That would just be a piss take. And he's hopefully going to come on, unless anything comes up on the 22nd. And he knows that we've been banging on about this stuff because he listens to the pod. And he might put us straight, and that's fine. I'm not emotionally invested in this. I just have yet to see anything from anyone.
Yeah.
To make me think that I'm barking up the wrong tree.
Well, we've had a few people now, not just these two guys, but there's been analysts as well who've sort of gone, sort of fair point.
The interesting challenge for Neil and anyone, I always respect anyone who's like influential and a senior exec coming on, because they're taking a risk. I don't think they're taking a risk on us being out of order, but they're taking a risk on the format and the fact it's conversational, and the fact it takes place over an hour and a half, and they could just let something slip which would get them in the shit. So I always respect
I think if we get him on, we should ask him about that, and also the 6G issue, because I think he's got quite strong views on 6G. And
in general, or the air interface?
Well, I think bring the air interface into it, but I think he's mentioned it before, question whether there's a need for 6G. I mean, he might not feel the same way now, but he's questioned the need for it in the past. So, which I know other execs have done. He might have changed his views. But
the interesting thing on this 5G air interface thing will be, if he's got some metrics, if he's got some science going, no lads, this is the bit you didn't know. This is why you got it wrong. Then fair enough. But if he doesn't have that, and on all he's got is, look, just take my word for it, then he's in a slightly sort of stickier position. But anyway, we'll see where that goes.
He might wholeheartedly agree.
He might wholeheartedly agree, but that's what I wonder about, where that leaves people like him in terms of their sort of professional and political position.
Well, but I think the operators themselves would go, well, we needed it because it was, it's a little bit better, and it pushes you up into these higher spectrum bands we needed.
Yeah,
and
that's fine. But then don't call it new radio when it's not new radio. It's a lie. It feels like a lie calling it new radio, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
But yes, no. I mean, I take the point. I take the point that you said about the chat from Etsy, and I take the point that everyone concedes about the marketing. We know I'm sure you've done it too. But I've written so many piss-taking articles about, what was it? I think maybe the first to blink this time was AT&T, and they called their 4G something like nearly 5G or some bullshit like that, or
5GE.
Yeah, 5G evolution, something like 5G.
Well, people are calling standalone real 5G, aren't they?
Yeah.
I bet that gets used.
So the
somewhere.
marketing people take a lot of liberties, and that's fine to a certain degree. That's fine, but new radio wasn't a marketing thing. It seemed to come from the engineering side.
Supposedly technical.
Yeah.
Even though it doesn't sound technical at all.
I also understand how, you do need, for the investment cycle, for the marketing cycle, for the general activity within the industry, it's useful to have new generations. But it feels like with 5G was perhaps the first time it feels really forced. 4G was obviously a step change. Anyone who got a 4G phone and having not had one before and realised that they had proper mobile internet as opposed to this sort of shitty kind of, you can just about load up a page of BBC Sport that you could on the previous one. Realised that was different, but you've said this lots of times, and I think you've mused it about 6G. Are we now too wedded to this 1G every decade thing, and is it becoming harder and harder to justify?
Yeah,
I think maybe. So yeah. But yes, but before we move on from that, it should be noted that there is lots of clever shit going on, not on the air interface side. So you made the point about standalone 5G, which is like it's more of like a new core, isn't it?
Yes. The network slicing sort of is built into the core, but I'm not sure if there's enough clever stuff going on outside the new radio and the air interface side of things, to be honest. I mean, I think that's where, if you look at a lot of the position papers about 6G at the moment, they talk about some quite outlandish things. I mean, I've been saying about this desire to push it up into terahertz bands, but actually a lot of the attention's on, it's more on what kind of services you could realise with 6G, really. You've got, I think the NGMN Alliance, which was it Next Generation Mobile Network Alliance, which is like a sort of club of operators.
Works for me.
Did a paper just in the run-up to MWC, and they had some really wacky things in that. Things like sort of, brain-computer interfaces, being able to kind of control machines with the power of your mind. Kind of like Clint Eastwood in Firefox,
Right.
That sort of...
Yeah.
I mean, maybe not
Matrix
quite as advanced as that, obviously, kind of stuff. But yeah, it's really out there sort of thinking, and then you read it and you start to think, well, and then Ericsson has this stuff about Internet of Senses, being able to smell and sort of feel over networks, but a lot of it's like you read it and you go, well, yeah, but how does it really tie in with the network side? Yes. Some of the technologies they're talking about don't sound like telecom technologies. They sound like a desire for the telecom community to get into something sexy.
And we had that, that was one of the hilarious things about having Maria on last week, is I had, in 2017, I'd written a piece taking the piss out of 5G being overhyped. And my exemplar for 5G overhype was this robotic surgery.
Yeah.
And a guy called Misha Dola, who was heading up a 5G sort of research thing in King's College, sort of got in touch on LinkedIn in the middle of Mobile Congress, because my story had led to a little bit of discussion.
Yeah.
And he sort of shat himself a little bit and thought, fuck, I want to correct the record and, make people realise it's not just hype, it is real.
Yeah.
And that's fine. I went to his little demo on the Ericsson stand and did a separate story and took photos, and it was all groovy. What I didn't know until I met her just before we started doing the pod is the person who basically set up all that stuff for him was Maria.
Right.
But I didn't get any sense from her that she was like, you bastard.
But at least with that, I mean, I'm as sceptical as anyone of that, and it gets taken the piss out of now, really, I think, the whole remote surgery stuff.
Well, I think it can happen, but the reason I brought it up is it just feels like it's a bit too much of a reach as a
it does, but
use case.
That's an application. The point is that when they were talking about 5G, I mean, yes, for example, they would grab hold of that and say, here's something you could do with a low latency, high throughput network that's ultra reliable.
Yeah.
But it was presented as an example of what you could do with it. Whereas some of the position papers at the moment on 6G are talking about things without really saying how the network comes into play, sort of thing.
No,
you know
totally,
what I mean?
I agree.
It's just
sort pure utopianism.
Brain-computer interface stuff to control machines. It's like, well, okay, I don't really see why you need a wide area 6G network for some of this stuff, kind of thing.
I think what they're ultimately aiming at, and I think this is one of the reasons, or certainly one of the reasons used by governments, especially the US government, to have such a flap about Huawei in 5G networks, because 5G networks were positioned as this step change in terms of the integration between the network and the rest of society. With 4G networks, we still sort of figured it's just basically a beam between that base station and this phone, and it's all under control.
Yeah.
Whereas the ubiquity of the network in 5G, and then, and that's being taken a step further with the hype you're hearing about 6G, I think it's one of the things that led everyone to shit themselves.
Well, it's actually nothing to do with 5G. It's just the fact that...
And it creates coronavirus on top of everything else.
It's just the Internet of Things, the concept of having connectivity in all sorts of devices, which might include, by the way, military tools, for instance, something that's getting used in a conflict zone, or that could be.
Yeah, Nick wrote about that.
Sensitive stuff.
I think it was AT&T getting into bed with Northrop Grumman this week.
Yeah, so it's not actually 5G itself, because you could put 4G in those things and do some of the same stuff, as we've just been saying.
Quite.
There's not really a reason.
In fact,
why
if you're going to try and control
4G,
a drone over a cellular network, you're going to want one that's good over low frequency. It's got long range, isn't it?
Yeah, so it was just the notion of 5G being associated more closely with the Internet of Things than 4G has been.
Quite.
I think that freaked people out
and
made them go, oh, we don't really want Huawei doing that then. But if 5-6 years ago, people had been positioning 4G as something that was a much bigger deal for the Internet of Things than it's turned out to be so far, We probably, I don't know, maybe we've had these worries a bit earlier than we have.
Well,
although
I think
a lot of it ties in with geopolitics.
Yeah, I think it coincided with Trump wanting to Xi's face.
For sure, yeah.
These things get so convoluted. Okay, well, look, we've chatted about this for a fair while now, so I'll move it on. But yeah, just to sort of say once more, I mean, my view, and I suspect yours, Ian, is that we haven't seen any evidence that new radio is actually new.
Ain't seen nothing yet.
Yeah. And so if anyone thinks we're talking shit, then get in touch. And if no one gets in touch, then we're right and we win again. Yay, us.
Yeah. Buy us beers, everyone.
Yes, exactly. Then send us beers for being so right and clever. So your thing, I won't do too much preamble because I pretty much got as far as about the headline, first paragraph, and then got distracted. But I saw that you wrote it and it looked interesting.
Yeah.
So you're basically talking about backhaul, primarily in your story in a UK context, but as you said earlier, it's not restricted to the UK. And for, so you've got a mobile operator who's got all these macro cells, got all these towers, got all this old radio, but that's got to get connected back to the core and the internet and everything somehow. And if they don't own the means for doing that, they got to rent it off someone else. So why don't I hand it over to you and you tell us what you wrote about?
I mean, it ties in with what we've just been talking about in a way, because you're talking about densification,
right?
Where this becomes an even bigger issue, because if you're putting in new small cells, for instance, you've got to backhaul them. I mean, that backhaul might not exist at all at the moment. You've got something, but then all of a sudden you've got to figure out. So the backhaul is basically the connection, as you say, like you've got your air interface thing between the phone and the
radio
tower.
And all that. Yeah.
And then your backhaul is from the tower to the core network to the kind of data center eventually that processes all the stuff and does the clever things.
That little box that the internet lives in.
The box that the internet lives in.
Have you ever seen
the internet box?
That IT Crowd episode?
No.
While I'm going off on tangents about comedy. So IT Crowd, are you familiar with IT Crowd?
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, and so to people who've never heard of the IT Crowd, it's a UK sitcom written by Graham Linehan, who also written a lot of other stuff like Father Ted. And it's basically set in the IT department of a sort of company. And the two main protagonists are these geeks, sort of comedy geeks, a bit like Big Bang Theory, but UK type of thing. And then the person in charge of them is this dilettante woman who just doesn't know what the fuck she's doing. Anyway. And hilarity ensues. And one time they try and wind her up because she's got to go and do a presentation about techie stuff, and she wouldn't know which end of a fucking computer to use. And so they decide to wind her up and say, "Why don't you do a presentation about the internet?" And then they get this black box that's about the size of a brick. And they go, in fact, you can even show them the internet. This is it. This is the internet, this box. And she's like, shit, really? And then she goes and shows it to all these other people who also haven't got a clue. And they're all like, wow. And the geeks are disappointed because they thought that she'd be humiliated. But in fact, everyone goes along with it because everyone's just as ignorant as her. Anyway.
Brilliant.
So that's the box where the internet lives. That all this stuff's eventually got to connect back to.
It's all going to go to that. And... the technologies that have been used to do that in the past have included things like microwave, which is also a kind of wireless technology.
It's like point-to-point wireless.
Yeah, and that uses really high frequencies, I think.
Yeah, well, microwave ones, to be precise.
And one of the concerns over microwave is that it's just not going to be good enough in the future for... I mean, I think microwave technology is always getting better, like these things do, but...
And you can always stick a little takeaway in the middle of it and warm it up.
Exactly. But,
what a shit dad joke.
Most people would, I think, most operators are sort of thinking that, in the future they're going to need, as we move to all this high bandwidth stuff and we start talking about things like the Metaverse and potentially in VR and AR, they're going to need to replace those microwave links with fiber links. That's really the sort of
I don't think you're ever going to get the throughput on a point-to-point microwave wireless link that you will through fiber.
So if you're a mobile-only operator and you don't have your own fibre network, then what's tended to happen is they've bought wholesale products from a fixed line player, which is usually the market incumbent.
Which in the UK would usually be Openreach.
In this country, for instance, Vodafone buys a lot of its backhaul products from Openreach, which is owned by BT.
Yeah. Well, sort of semi-owned. They had that weird manoeuvre, didn't they, where they got to make it autonomous but still owned.
It's still owned by them, though.
Bullshit.
Yeah,
I hate when they do
separated
things like that.
but owned. Yeah. I mean, so that.
But who can fire the CEO OpenReach? The CEO of BT can, so it owns it. So
this issue actually shows why that's such bollocks.
Right.
So, and this is and the reason this is a concern for Vodafone at the moment is because. They're rolling out 5G at the moment. Data demands are going up a lot. We've seen them go up massively in the pandemic on both fixed and mobile networks. There's now talk about rolling out standalone 5G, where you're going to get even more data on the network. The use of multiband radios, more advanced applications. So we're going to see data demands go up even more. Potentially, we've got new device types coming on. All of a sudden, your backhaul is looking like it could become, if you've got microwave links that need replacing, you need to move to fibre. But you also need to look at what sort of fibre products you're buying, and the stuff they're getting from OpenReach at the moment is suboptimal. Basically, it would be their position. And
is that a polite way of putting it?
Yeah, and
that's business speak for shite. And
the reason is what they ideally want, and this is an issue that's actually been running for quite a long time in the UK. So it's not a secret that this has been a topic, but it sort of got rejected this request that mobile only operators had, and therefore there's not really a chance to sort of resurrect it now until there's another market review in a few years' time. But what they really want is something called dark fibre. And what that allows you to do is basically take control of the underlying fibre line and put your own electronic equipment at either end of it.
Yeah, because that's basically what fibre by itself is, just literally a bit of fibre. But then you've got clever shit at either end.
It's unlit fibre, essentially.
That sends data over.
You put your electronics at either end of it and you light it up.
So the purpose of referring to it as dark fibre is you're saying we will provide the shit at either end.
Exactly. And
control the whole process.
So what they do at the moment...
All you do is lend us the actual physical fibre.
So BT doesn't sell dark fibre, or at least it doesn't sell it as, or I should say OpenReach doesn't sell it.
But people want it to, don't they?
As widely as someone like Vodafone wants it to. And what that means is that you have to buy these, in certain areas, you have to buy these quite expensive leased line products from them, where you're essentially, it's fibre, but what you're basically doing is buying capacity on BT's network. You're using their electronics, and it's charged on a sort of capacity basis.
It's metered, basically.
It's kind of metered. Yeah. They would say it's very expensive, and that is what their argument would be. And every time they kind of have, an increase in capacity as it goes up each year, they're basically having to pay more money for these lease line products, and it's all viewed as being quite unpredictable, basically, and doesn't give them the kind of uncertainty they want, and it's a growing cost,
and everything.
It's potentially a big cost in the network that could carry on going up unless they can get access to dark fibre.
And that applies anytime. We've spoken loads of times about this is a bit of a tangent, but about the tendency in the telecoms industry for them to increasingly sort of sell stuff that they used to own themselves to other people, like, let's say, the physical towers, or it could be real estate, or it could be, or that we also talk about this in the context of like public cloud and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
When you relinquish control to someone else, yes, there's efficiencies born of that, but by definition, you relinquish a degree of control.
Yeah.
And the third party you relinquish it to can shift the goalposts whenever they fucking want within the legal constraints of whatever agreement you got.
Yeah, but it's a really complicated issue. So Ofcom hasn't regulated this. It hasn't sort of weighed in and forced BT to do what. By the way, I should say the reason that it shows this whole separation issue of BT and OpenReach to be a nonsense is. Right. OpenReach isn't treating Vodafone any differently from how it treats EE, which is its sibling. It's also owned by BT, the mobile operator. Yep. EE. They're both treated on exactly the same terms. The difference is when higher costs for EE due to capacity needs is basically higher sales for OpenReach. So it's effectively an exercise in exchanging money around the group. Yeah. One bit might be paying more, but another bit's making more, essentially. Which is why it's not which is why the whole thing about separating OpenReach and having it run at arm's length from the rest of the business is kind of a bit of a nonsense, because they're still essentially part of the same group. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose I take your point. I don't know how they do their accounting and their public reporting, but you're not quite talking about cross-subsidising, but you seem to be, unless I've misunderstood you, saying that EE's not going to be so bothered about additional backhaul costs because that ends up going in the pot anyway.
EE might be, but BT Group wouldn't, because if one bit is losing out, the other bit's making a lot of money.
Yeah. So they might just tell the head of EE to just grin and bear it. Yeah. No, of course.
If they suddenly, let's say OpenReach suddenly goes, your backhaul fee's gone up by $1 billion. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, but whatever.
But that's money that will just go to OpenReach.
No, totally. And there's only one share.
Another bit of the group's
there's
making more money.
There's not EE shares or OpenReach shares. There's only BT shares.
So it's
totally. And that's what ultimately they care about when you're a public company.
Which is why it's not. Yeah. Which is why the whole thing, I think, about legal separation or whatever it's called is it's kind of a bit of a nonsense.
Unless it was totally separate, which it never was.
Yeah.
And you just talk about increments of like having a separate CEO and a separate logo and a separate HQ.
So I think it's fair to say EE is still at an advantage over the other and would not have the same concerns about this whole dark fibre issue as Vodafone, essentially. It wouldn't have the same interest in it. The reason, so Ofcom doesn't mandate dark fibre. It doesn't force BT to provide sort of at cost dark fibre.
Does Ofcom butt in about what it can charge?
Well, it doesn't. But that's the point. It doesn't, because it would come in with a sort of regulated product that you have to do on pricing principles. You have to provide a dark fibre.
So Ofcom in principle could charge a bazillion quid. I mean, is there no cap? There's no regulation. I find it hard to believe there's no regulation at all.
BT doesn't provide a dark fibre product.
No, in the way that Vodafone is there no regulation of the leased line?
I'm sure there is.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, there must be regulation.
Sorry, we were talking across each other.
There must be regulated products. No, I'm sorry. On the dark fibre front, there isn't the regulation that Vodafone would like to see to make OpenReach offer those dark fibre services widely, and it's obviously been opposed by OpenReach. Otherwise it'd provide one, I guess. But their position is that I mean, they've made a number of arguments for why they don't want to do it, but one is that it would disincentivize investment. It would force everybody to keep using the OpenReach network, and it would, it would sort of constrain investment elsewhere, essentially, which is a fair point that's also been made, by the way, by CityFibre and Virgin Media, as I understand it. Certainly CityFibre has argued against having any regulation of dark fibre, because if you have a regulated product available from the incumbent, you're basically undermining the opportunity for somebody to come in and be disruptive in the market.
Okay.
So, and I think partly on that basis, Ofcom decided it wasn't going to do anything to sort of have a dark fibre product introduced. But so where does that leave Vodafone? Well, it can get dark fibre from CityFibre, which is this company that's backed by Goldman Sachs and building out a kind of rival fibre network in the UK. But it's not a nationwide deployment. I mean, their target, I think, is sort of on the residential side. Their target sort of 8 million properties by the mid-2020s. And in terms of fibre out to towers for backhaul purposes, it's just not anywhere near. I mean, I don't know what the figures are, but they themselves would say it's not comparable. So there's a lot of the country basically where you can't use CityFibre for dark fibre for mobile.
Obviously, understandably, they've focused on. Yeah,
and then they can also get it from Virgin Media O2. But one of their reasons for, last year Vodafone opposed to they complained about the merger between Virgin Media and O2 on the basis that it would create a sort of disincentive for that company to carry on offering dark fibre services, for the same reason that that OpenReach doesn't offer one. You've basically got a fully integrated fixed and mobile operator. All of a sudden, it might see an interest in not providing that kind of competitive product.
Why would it give a level playing field to competitors of a MNO that it owns?
But that hasn't happened at the moment.
Right.
They still do buy services from Virgin Media O2. Virgin Media O2 is still a kind of supplier of dark fibre to Vodafone.
Of dark fibre?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. So there's two other players they can get it from. They can get it from CityFibre, which is not nationwide.
Right, so I thought you were just talking about backhaul full stop.
No.
Okay.
So dark fibre is not available from OpenReach.
Yeah.
They get it from CityFibre, which isn't nationwide, and they can get it from Virgin Media O2.
Okay.
But they were worried that the merger between Virgin Media and O2 might at some point force them to sort of, not force them, but compel them to kind of take it off the market, if you like, because there's this integrated player. It's pretty much the same reason why OpenReach doesn't have a sort of incentive to offer it, they would say. The trouble then is that you've got, what you're saying is you've basically got a dark fibre monopoly in some parts of the country with Virgin Media O2. They're the only supplier of that product. So the situation's just not ideal at all for you, if you're thinking about where it's going to go in the future, and who knows what could happen with traffic demands.
Yeah,
they've got this problem that kind of needs addressing. So what can they do? Well, they can either buy a fibre network themselves and develop it, I guess. But at the moment, there isn't.
Don't think they got the cash for that one.
Well, the problem is at the moment, City Fibre is the next best option, yeah? And they have this sort of close relationship with City Fibre anyway on the sort of residential side, and they're obviously using it for dark fibre for mobile to some extent. But by their own admission, it doesn't provide a nationwide service. So you're buying something that doesn't address it. You'd have to then invest heavily to sort of build it up. Or you can build your own fibre backhaul. But again, that's incredibly costly. And I mean, we all know that
you might as well get into the fibre game.
We all know about the investment challenges there are at the moment in the business, and
I mean,
Vodafone
even City Fibre every now and then has to pick up the phone to Goldman Sachs and go, "Can we have another bill?"
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, but I don't think it's just I was talking about Vodafone here because it's from a whole sort of UK perspective, but I don't think it's just a UK issue. I think this is an issue for companies throughout the world, actually, but certainly European operators, Europe, which has lots of mobile operators in each market that still don't have their own fixed line infrastructure, and backhaul's been a long running issue. People have been talking about this since the days of 4G, whether you can, whether the products that they can buy in the market from the incumbent are actually good enough for them to be able to keep supporting high bandwidth data intensive mobile services over the next few years.
So that's the question. You said a problem. I was just about to ask you. You've partly answered it already. Why is it a problem? I mean, if OpenReach sort of leased line solution provides the bandwidth they need, yes, it doesn't provide the control, the autonomy, perhaps even the flexibility or the value for money they want, but it solves the problem.
Well, it's as I say, it's higher costs each year every time your capacity is going up, isn't it?
Are you identifying that as the key problem? Not that they won't be able to get the backhaul, but that they'll be held to ransom.
I think those fibre lines are going to be capable of doing what they need to do. I think, OpenReach is investing, I think now in 10 gigabit per second, sort of, every sort of EU site being equipped with the latest PON technology. And that is actually new as opposed to the radio. There's a huge amount of fibre investment. I mean, this is interesting. If you look at sort of investment figures this is actually what's driving a lot of the fixed line investment, I think, at the moment. We look at Nokia, for instance, as a company that's the biggest, certainly, fixed line broadband access equipment provider outside China. And if you look at their numbers last year, where did all the growth come from? It was all fixed line. That bit grew 35% revenues in fixed line last week. Now, a lot of that was residential broadband and even business broadband, but I think a lot of residential broadband driven by the pandemic, people working from home and the need for moving beyond GPON to XGS PON, and then not a lot of people are talking about 25 GPON at the moment, but that's certainly something they've started to provide. But when I interviewed the guy who heads up their fixed line business, was actually here a couple of weeks ago after one of our pod sessions.
You alluded to it last week as well.
He was saying that there's a lot of it is in the backhaul. It's actually backhaul investments, and the projections that Omdia has, our sister company, for fixed line spending, if you like. I think broadband access, how they define it, will be broadband access equipment revenues, is massive growth. It's about 8.5 billion, I think, at the moment, annually, what gets spent on broadband access equipment globally. And by 2026, they've got it down at 15.8 billion, from 8.7 to 15.8.
Right.
Mobile equipment isn't going up at that rate over the next few years. You look at the RAN market and what the projections are for the RAN market by 2026. All the stuff's about how much Open RAN's going to take of that share. It's not about the overall size of the pie being a lot bigger.
And when you hear about like private equity and people like Goldman Sachs or whatever get involved,
so I don't
fibre,
think it's that the networks are not going to be there. I think it's more to do with the kind of products that they can buy and whether they're economical. And if they're not economical, then mobile-only operators have got a problem. They've got a competitive problem.
Right, I hear you. So that's yet another sort of...
so it's an issue for...
margin risk for them.
It's a margin risk for them, and I think it's also an issue for regulators, isn't it? Because if there's perceived to be some kind of imbalance in the market, some kind of unfairness because of this this backhaul situation, then maybe it needs. I mean, Ofcom has. I don't know how it works in other countries, but I'm assuming it's the same sort of thing. They have their market review every few years, and they propose remedies and decide what to do about it. And I'm not saying that mandating dark fibre is necessarily the answer, because I think actually some of the OpenReach reasons for not doing it sound really valid to me. You don't want unnecessary regulation. You don't want to create a situation where if you're looking at someone like City Fibre to come along and provide that as an alternative, you don't want that to be disincentivised, do you? So you've got to be quite careful what you do with regulation. But on the other hand, they've got to worry about where this could go. If they create some kind of skew where mobile-only players are suddenly just looking a lot less competitive for whatever reason.
Yeah, well, I totally take your point about regulation, and that's always the interesting thing. Whenever I talk about something like regulation, I always feel the need to put my cards on the table and say that my instincts are always for light touch and for laissez-faire sort of free marketism. But I know that you can't be a pure free marketer, because a pure free marketer naturally leads to consolidation and monopolies and a few people taking the piss. So you need to have regulation, especially in industries that got an incredibly high barrier to entry, like telecoms, and that were former national monopolies anyway.
Yeah.
But do you? So I take your point about not over-regulating and not disincentivizing investment and all that sort of thing. But if you were in charge of Ofcom, and to be honest, you probably know more about telecoms than the person who is in charge of Ofcom, from what I can tell from her CV. Although they did just this week, we wrote a story, they did just hire some guy who's been in telecoms for 20 years to be the head of Spectrum.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily this issue. But, the person that they replaced Sharon White with, I can't remember her name, Melanie Dawes, something like that.
I don't know.
Not Marjorie Dawes, that one that used to be in Little Britain. But and I'm sure she's really bright and experienced and competent and all that sort of thing. But I saw no indication she knew one end of a fucking phone from another.
Yeah.
From her background. And then we got good old Doris in charge of it from the government side, who clearly clueless. So if it's you brought in, they're selling Bojo just went, we need someone who knows a thing or two, and you went, go on then, I'll give it a crack. Would you institute regulation to force OpenReach to make a dark fibre offering or not?
I'd be wary of doing it for the reasons that they've set out, because I think, if even the players that are trying to build alternative dark fibre networks are saying that regulation wouldn't be helpful.
But they would say that.
But it's a valid reason. City Fibre doesn't want BT forced to offer dark fibre at a regulated price, which drives all the business their way, and then all of a sudden, where are they? Yeah.
Well, hold on. If that's their objection,
that's basically what the main objection is based on. If you have pricing regulation for dark fibre products, it creates a disincentive for alternatives to come in.
But I don't understand then. If that would be advantageous to BT and disadvantageous to their fibre competitors, why isn't BT doing it without having to be forced to by regulators? Why isn't it a thing that BT would want to do?
I don't think BT wants to have any regulated pricing stuff forced on it at all.
Right.
So,
but why isn't it by itself offering a dark fibre thing? If it's such a threat to City Fibre, if it's such a sort of like an edgy business thing to do.
Well, look, City Fibre's geared up to offer dark fibre. That's how they've built their entire business, as a dark fibre specialist.
I see.
That's how they've come along, and it's not an easy thing to do. BT has long been providing sort of lease line services, and they're not known to be a dark fibre
because you've got to have it set up at either end of the fibre to do it.
I think there's all sorts of reasons why they wouldn't just want to leap into doing dark fibre, and they would feel it's not something that they could invest in and have support for doing that sort of thing and do it economically and do it well. Fair enough. I think there's all sorts of reasons.
But if they were forced, then they'd do it. And then City Fibre's point is
City Fibre doesn't want a regulated...
you're sort of manipulating the market to create greater competition.
Which is what you're... Yeah.
Fair enough.
So I think you've got to be quite careful about how it's done. I mean, I think what the regulator could do, which isn't strictly to do with dark fibre, but I think it's related, is certainly try and... I mean... Fibre rollout is going quite well, I think, in the UK. If you look at the figures, certainly, in terms of OpenReach's build-out, how many homes they've passed and all that, how much it goes up each month, each quarter, it seems to be on a bit of a roll. The UK used to be terrible, I think, in full fibre coverage, and it's still not great. But it is catching up quite quickly. If you look at those FTTH Council Europe presentations, state of Europe kind of thing, comparing different countries.
The state of Europe.
They look a lot better than they did, but there's still complaints about how hard it is to get access to, to buildings, to properties, how hard it is to get permissions for things, how hard it is to sort of get past the red tape, and and how I think there's things they could do to be more business friendly from the perspective of a fibre investor, to make it easier for those companies, because that's basically what you want, isn't it? Is to have more companies in the market. I mean, it's still not an ideal market in the sense that we have this huge national incumbent, Openreach, that is the only option really in parts of the country. It's the only company with infrastructure. It's kind of like you have with the trains. You only have one line that you can use.
I know.
And now the trouble with the trains is we can't just go and build 3 or 4 lines running in parallel, and it just doesn't make economic sense.
I always thought that's I'm generally a fan of denationalisation and private sector because of competition, competitive pressures. But where it's impossible to have competitive pressures, i.e. 3 trains running in parallel and one's a bit better than the other.
You can't do it.
It's bullshit, and that's always happened in the trains. They've always ended up going bust.
They have
these providers, and then the taxpayers had to sort of fill in the.
But I think, who knows how it'll play out in? It's a question that's up in the air. I think is where that all leads, because what's going on in parts of the UK at the moment, in some areas, is that you do have a lot of fibre builders, and you have this situation now where you could end up with 3 or even 4 networks passing the same properties, and obviously only one's ever going to be getting used at any one time. Mm-hmm. So 75% of the investment that's been put into that area to build fibre is effectively wasted. Yeah, you could argue.
You could.
And but on the other hand, we don't want a situation where there's only one monopoly provider, infrastructure provider across the whole country. Because I think all the models that have been tried of having, leased line services, for instance, which Vodafone's still complaining about. Obviously, that's not ideal. Having different ways of allowing companies to use those networks. I still think at some point you want. I mean, what's the other way of doing it is to do what the Australians have done and have this sort of completely separated. This
state-run monopoly.
It wouldn't even need to be state-run, I don't think, would it? But certainly, if you have a
monopoly.
If it's.
I mean, I my feelings on monopolies is they're bad whether they're state monopolies or private monopolies. But I suppose at least a state monopoly.
But the point
there'd
about
be a greater degree of transparency about how it's run.
I suppose the argument in favour of that is what we've got at the moment effectively is a monopoly in parts of the country where there's only
just
the
as we have with
network.
train tracks.
But the problem with it is that and this comes back to the point about EE paying Openreach for the services it gets. The money stays within the company. Yeah, there's an inbuilt unfairness there, isn't there? One company is providing retail services as well as being the wholesaler.
I mean, this is where you're completely spot on to make the rail analogy. When monopolies are natural, i.e. it's not in any way practicable to have many different providers of the same service because you're talking about train tracks.
Yeah.
You've got a real dilemma. And in practice, if we thought we could do it, I mean, the real reason, sort of free market types like me are into it is because we know we think we know what drives human psychology, what incentivises people, and that's personal profit.
Yeah.
And the reason why, if there's competition, you get good value for the consumer, is because there's an incentive for them to drive prices down in order to get more business, and then everyone gets a little bonus at the end of the year, and they get to go off and have a nice holiday and get pissed and all that sort of thing. And the problem is, within any monopoly, you obviously don't have that because they're not competing. No matter what they do, they could do the shittest job ever, but because there's no choice, people are still going to keep using them, and that applies to a public, a state-owned monopoly. The thing that's frustrating is we haven't found a way of incentivising people outside of personal profit. And that's why state monopolies tend to be shit and corrupt and inefficient. because we just haven't found another part of human psychology that makes people bounce out of bed first thing on a Monday morning and crack on and do their job well.
Yeah.
Except for, I suppose, the stick and carrot. The carrot being personal profit, the stick being fear of being sacked.
Yeah.
And that's all that seems to motivate people to get up in the morning.
If there's
exactly
only one company there, so yeah.
So it's a real dilemma, and I don't know the answer. I don't know what the best way, for example, to run the British rail network is.
But coming back to telecom, I think one thing you probably want is something a little bit like what's happening with the TowerCo model at the moment, where you have neutral hosts, they're called, so they don't provide retail services, and it's open to anybody, but there isn't just one of them.
Well, and we've spoken about the problem with people like that Spanish company owning most of the towers, Cellnex,
yeah. I mean, that could be a problem in the future, but they don't. They're not a monopoly. They're a powerful player, but they're not a monopoly player.
No.
And you have alternatives there, and that's probably what you want with the fibre market is fibre cos that are open to everybody, but independently owned. They don't have their own sort of retail arm.
But there needs to be
some infrastructure competition.
There needs to be like at least 3 of them. Or at least 2. I mean, I suppose 2 is the minimum for competition.
I don't know if it needs to be on that basis, but my view is I don't think it's healthy just to have one.
No, I agree.
One fibre line provider, and at the moment it's better than it was. It's a lot better than it was. There's lots of too much competition actually in some parts of the country.
Right.
But you've got
those little altnets and all that going on.
Yeah, I mean, London, you've got GNet rolling out networks, you've got Openreaches there, you've got Virgin Media, you've got City Fibre. I don't think City Fibre's in London, actually, but you've certainly got a handful of networks there. In other parts of the country, you would have 2 or 3 options.
You've got one place that just does Hull. Isn't that KCOM or something like that?
Yeah.
Weird place
but there are places where you can only get OpenReach, and I mean, there's also not spots, aren't there, where there's nothing at all. But there's places where your only option is sort of OpenReach, and I think, from a wholesale perspective, and I'm not sure that's, from an infrastructure perspective, I should say, and I don't think that's ideal. And I think anything you can do to try and change that will improve this dark fibre situation ultimately that Vodafone faces, as well as having an impact on other markets. But I don't necessarily think that coming along and saying Openreach should be forced to provide dark fibre, because of regulation, is the way to do it.
Hey, okay.
Which is a really long answer to your question.
No, but I mean, but it's honest. That's.
But I'm not a regulatory expert, and no one's offering me a job to run off from.
That's also the point of podcasts. I'll bang. Me and Pierre will bang on about people like Joe Rogan and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The difference between he's not watching that game again, is he?
He's watching the game. He's not even listening to us. He's not even listening to our exciting conversation about neutral hosts.
We're about to talk about the Metaverse bit, so you might want to get involved. It's up to you. In fact, you can talk. You can tell the rest of the class what you've been doing while we've been talking about wholesome telecom stuff.
Yeah, because that's more metaversey anyway.
Well, quite. But we'll bang on about podcasts, and the point is, you look at conventional media. You look at something like, I don't know, 9 o'clock news in the UK or CNN or whatever, where they get people on and they've got like 30 seconds. And they go, right, what should we do, this or that? And they go, well, I think we should do this. All right, thanks, see you later. And it's all just so incredibly compressed. Yeah. The point of this is it's completely right for you to come out with a convoluted, nuanced, not necessarily conclusive answer, because these things are fucking complicated.
Yeah.
And finding that optimum ground for a piece of infrastructure that creates a natural monopoly because of the incredibly high barrier to entry, but in which you still want to introduce some degree of market forces to keep prices down, it's really difficult to sort out, and I don't claim to have the answer. I like in terms of rail, I'm just about old enough to remember British Rail back in like the 70s and 80s, and that was a bit shit. And that was a classic example of something that was owned by the public.
Then you had Network Rail to make it sound less British.
Yeah, well, then they supposedly privatised it all, but lots of those things went bust or they were shit or whatever. So rail's a great example of how it's really hard to know what the best solution is. Yeah. Anyway. I'll move it on. So, on that, I wonder who'll own the Metaverse while we're talking about infrastructure.
Is it going to be a Metaverse monopoly?
Well, quite. Well, I mean, that's clearly what...
investing in real estate?
That's clearly what the artist formerly known as Facebook would like. They've bet their fucking brand on it, haven't they? Andrew wrote a story, something we spotted yesterday evening came up, where Lego, famous for Lego, but Lego's so much more than when I was a kid. Now they like make movies.
Well, it's bloody expensive, is what it is.
Fucking expensive.
I mean, did you go through Lego phases with your kids?
I did, but you know what I did with my kids? I just went on eBay and just bought a bucket of like old bricks.
See, I should have done that, but we went through a phase with Alex not even that long ago. He's 12 now, and at 9 or 10 he was still really into Lego.
Right.
And he used to ask for these ridiculously expensive
like 100
sets
quid or
at
something.
Christmas. More than that even, something like 200 or 300 quid. And you're thinking, we can't really get something that's 200 quid. So it's always sort of bargaining him down to something acceptable.
I know, and then all he gets is a little car, and he's like, well,
and that costs,
I've got shit
that was like 60 quid or something.
No, I mean, there's obviously some fucked up margin going on at Lego. But, where they will claim to own it is they create these new little sub-brands, that can create a whole new world. And then you can create a spaceship. But, below a certain age with kids, your imagination's so good, you can just give them the basic bricks and they'll put them together and they'll decide that that's a plane and they'll go vroom vroom and do all that. So that's what we did. We just bought the basic bricks.
I've never looked at Lego's margins or anything. I've never done that.
It'd be worth a look.
It would be.
I think
I've looked at Pfizer's margins.
I suspect they're doing all right. I know, well, that'll be the next thing. The next pandemic, they'll say you've got to build really pricey spaceships out of Lego and their margins will go up even more.
I have a Lego bonsai that I need to build still.
What's that?
It's like an adult one, It's
adult Lego.
It's just a bonsai.
Is that like adult? Do you remember there was a little phase where people had adult colouring in books?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was like, no, it's not colouring in like a kid. It's stress relief and all that. It kind of fuck off. It's colouring in
meditation.
Book. Yeah, meditation. Do me a favour. It's a colouring in book. It's like when Harry Potter came out with adult cover versions. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
You'd have ones with just little fun kiddie ones, and then you'd have ones with just
ones that parents could read on the tube and it looks acceptable
and not feel like they're being a kid.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Lego, and then there's Epic Games, and Epic Games is a games developer that is probably best known for a game called Fortnite,
fighting Apple.
And fighting Apple, yeah. I don't know. It's a sort of stalemate at the moment, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an interesting tangent, that Epic Apple one. Maybe we'll come on to that. Maybe it'll come up when we talk about the commercial sides of the metaverse. But yeah, Fortnite's really popular among kids, and it's like a sort of MMO, massively multiplayer online type of thing. Is that right, Ian? I mean, my kids never played it that much, but I think Alex did. He play
Fortnite?
It? Yeah. It's like an open world, and you just go around.
It's a bit like
forming little gangs.
Have you seen the movie Battle Royale?
I haven't.
Which is a Japanese film where a bunch of kids get dropped off on an island and they basically have to fight each other or the more recently that South Korean one,
Hunger Games,
Hunger Games, or
Squid Games.
So you're on this, like, you're parachuted into this island. You pick your sort of avatar, whatever they call it, and you can pick up weapons and buy them. And
are you by yourself, or is it a team? Or
well, people tend to team up with. You can play with. People do form teams, but the way it works is that I think maybe there's an option where you can have a team that wins. But usually the way I've seen it played is people do sort of work together, but at the end of it, one person has to sort of win.
Well, has to prevail. So it's time limited. So it's not like an MMO, like something like World of Warcraft, where you can spend years of your life leveling up and acquiring new magic weapons and shit like that. Anyway, but it's in this sort of virtual environment. It's in quite an open environment.
Yeah,
it's not like old school computer games when we were kids, where it's very defined and you're playing against a computer AI and all that sort of thing. It's in quite an open PvP.
It is.
And you can
PvP,
chat to
they
each
call
other.
it, don't they? PvP,
yeah,
there's
a whole world that you can walk around.
Well, Grand Theft Auto is also pretty much the same thing, except you're in the city of Los Angeles.
And you're incentivized to be a complete bastard.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so Epic makes that. And so Lego and Epic have got together and they said, we want to build a metaverse designed for children. Now,
aren't they all?
No, I can see why Lego might, presumably.
One without lap dancing clubs, they mean.
They've probably got, Lego is, they've got Pierre doing his Lego bonsai. But generally, Lego's aimed at kids, or big kids like Pierre, who, incidentally, we should name and shame, as while we've been recording this, has been watching someone play a computer game that he used to play when he was a fucking kid. So Pierre's never quite grown up, bless him. Never
it's just a bit of nostalgia. I'm just looking at the video.
Yeah, if that's how you want to phrase it, mate, that's fine.
It'd be weird if I actually played the game.
Oh, well, I don't think that's weird because I still play computer games all the time. So when I'm taking the piss out of you, I'm obviously applying it to myself as well.
Since I don't have a PC, so I cannot play anything.
Right. Well, no, I'm still playing Civilization 5 a fair bit at the moment.
How old is that?
It's about 10 years old, I think.
Oh, that's not bad.
Yeah, the original Civ was... God, I remember playing Civ 2 when I was certainly 25 years ago.
Is that one of the plebeians?
It's like, yeah, you're basically...
Caesar was another one.
Yeah, you create a civilization, hence the name, from like the Bronze Age, and then you grow up in technologies and you expand your land, and it's like a God Sim type of thing, turn based. I quite like those. I can't handle first person shooter ones; they get a bit too hectic for me. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, no, we all play computer games. I'm only gently taking the piss because it certainly applies to me as well. But on the whole, Lego is for kids. As is Fortnite. So you can see why these two companies would figure we can get together and do something metaversey for kids. Now, Andrew wrote it up. I mean, I edited it, but I'm trying to remember precisely what I said. But I think the long and short of it is it was quite vague. It was more of a sort of aspirational thing rather than here's the metaverse we've already created.
Like his quote from World Congress from Andrew. It works.
Yeah. Quite. Yeah. Well, you can imagine that Andrew isn't easily won over by hype, which is a good quality in a journalist, and it serves him well. But I think the reason I wanted to bring it up, other than just to bring up the metaverse again, which is obviously not going away as a thing, and we get concepts like sort of Web3, and I encountered another one, a completely different story. Japan's got a thing they call Society 5.0.
What happened to 1, 2, 3, and 4?
Well, they go through them all like they're like industrial revolution, all that kind of shit.
They didn't have Bruce Willis in them.
And so everyone's got a version 4 or 5 or 3 or whatever. And the metaverse, I think, is sort of trying to position itself as the... I don't know which iteration. It doesn't really matter whether you call it 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But we had the original internet, which was possibly, you could argue, even pre-2000.
Just pages.
Sort of very early days, yeah, pages, directories, Yahoo, that sort of thing. And then you had the sort of proper internet, which is sort of Google dictated. And then maybe you could say you got the mobile internet, which is Uber and that sort of thing. And then maybe we're at the next phase beyond that, where the internet becomes this virtual world, rather than interacting with it through web pages like BBC Sport or whatever. Your main way of navigating the internet is through this sort of virtual environment, and you sort of virtually go for a walk. Personally, I'm not buying into any of this fucking crap, if I'm honest. I'm quite happy with the internet as it is now, but then I'm 50 years old.
Yeah.
So they're probably not aiming it at me. I'll be all like, well, I had a stick and a hoop to play with when I was a kid, and I thought myself lucky.
You'll be the only bloke down the pub while everybody else has got their metaverse helmets on.
Exactly, drinking virtual beer.
Exactly.
I mean, I tell you what, once VR can get you actually pissed, then they might have a convert in me. If you put one of those on, and
yeah, you're getting into the whole Strange Days thing, aren't you?
like those beer.
You put something in the back of your neck, and it's like a sensory experience.
You get the beer goggles with the straw.
Literally beer goggles. I know, beer goggles. I don't know if you've heard this term in the UK. Beer goggles usually used to describe how people become more attractive the more pissed you get. Yeah, so I've banged on for a bit. I'll throw it out to the floor. I think what I really want to talk about is the desirability of there being... We're all parents, granted of different age kids. The desirability of there being a metaverse for kids and how we feel. I'll throw it over to you, Ian, first. How we feel about there being a metaverse for kids, and how much... how much control we think as parents we might have over it, how, what our kids might get up to there, that sort of thing.
I'm not sure that a metaverse for adults is very desirable, to be honest.
Well, yeah, as I was just saying, yeah. But what about kids?
I think it's too early to start saying let's have a metaverse for kids. I mean, we haven't got a metaverse at the moment, let's be honest. It's a concept.
Not really.
It's something that a guy wrote about in a science fiction book about 30 years ago, that all of a sudden Facebook's jumped on it and everybody's talking about the metaverse because it sounds like... And what is it really? It's almost like just another word for virtual reality, to me, it seems. like a virtual reality world. But
except a lot of the time you might interact with it in a not VR way. Like, Sony had Second Life like 20 years ago.
Second Life was actually this, I think.
Yeah.
But it failed because it just wasn't, obviously the tech wasn't ready, really, I think. Which doesn't mean it won't work again. But I think, Pierre and I were talking about this before we started off. It's really unclear what people mean when they talk about the metaverse, because the internet's one thing. It's one. It's recognised as one global interconnected network that you go to. You get your internet browser and you're on it, and you can go and visit any. You can go and visit all these different addresses. And you can. And
you get a sort of facsimile of real life.
Yeah, you can walk down. You can walk down the internet street and knock on anybody's door and get into it, and nobody has. All right, this is a slightly different issue. Getting onto sort of decentralised, centralised thing about whether too few companies are in control of the whole thing.
The streets are a bit different in China.
But actually, to me, that's not very different from how...
locked doors.
It's not very different from how the normal world works anyway, actually, where lots of big companies, not a small number of big companies rather, are in charge of whole sectors. I don't think the internet's massively different in that respect. I think the internet's main problem is it's not been regulated very well or supervised very well. But the thing with the metaverse is that no one really knows. I don't think that model is necessarily what we're going to have with the metaverse. We're not going to have one metaverse that someone like Facebook runs, and you go there and you can get an Apple product easily or a Google product, because Apple and Google wouldn't stand for that. They want their own metaverses. So we're probably going to end up with multiple metaverses.
But it comes back to, like Pierre mentioned, the Apple versus Epic thing. I mean, that's over billing and over Apple wanting to control every financial transaction that happens via the Apple platform.
Yeah. So I don't see the metaverse as a successor to the internet, really. It's more like a successor to the social media platforms approach, really, where you have your own metaverse platform and
metaverse store,
and then it's a store, but it's one company in control of that. It's not. It's not that you can go there and do anything you want. You're still within this certain company's the way. And
why is it an upgrade on what we got now?
I don't know if it would be an upgrade on what. I mean, it just sounds. It's hard to speculate about where this is going to go because we haven't seen any of it yet. We haven't really even seen proper virtual reality stuff that's done well at scale in a kind of mass market way. So. So to me, I just think I think anybody talking about doing a metaverse for kids is cynically trying to trying to get ahead of the game.
Market,
and where's no one gone yet? Oh, they haven't gone for old age pensions or kids yet. Old age pensioners are rubbish, aren't they? Because they're going to be dead by the time we get it together.
And they'll get confused. Let's market it at kids. I mean, to me, it just doesn't sound. So, Pierre, you're younger than us, and you have younger kids than us. Your kids presumably are still just like doing CBBS and nursery rhymes and shit like that. But presumably, you think about what they're going to be up to in a few years' time. How do you feel about the metaverse for kids?
It's funny because over Christmas I was at my brother-in-law's and he has 3 boys, 10, 8 and 7. And they all played VR, especially the 8-year-old. But the main thing is when they play VR, you don't know what they play because it's in the headset. So like the 10-year-old wanted to play Resident Evil on the big TV.
Oh my God.
So at least, he couldn't hide it. He couldn't say, he had to ask for his dad, and he's like, no, this is 17.
It's properly gory, isn't it?
And in the end, he kind of did play it anyway. But so, the thing with VR is that unless you ask them, or unless they connect, apparently you can connect your phone, like the Oculus one, you can connect your phone to it so you could see what they're doing.
Spy on them.
Yeah, but I mean, they probably need to accept.
Right, yeah.
So I think in terms of you talking about all the metaverses, I think it's basically there's going to be one metaverse per device. Right now there's only 2 really. There's Oculus and HTC Vive.
Yeah, Vive.
That's it. And then Apple is going to come in with like something insane next year. Huh?
Sony's got a VR headset.
See, I've never heard of it. So
right, okay, can't be
that good. But so I think whoever will win will be who has the best device, the best hardware, the most immersive one.
There's an interesting.
And developers will go to that.
The Economist this week, because there's a whole big feature on the wearables in it,
right?
But very much done from the perspective of the next wearable is going to be sort of virtual reality headsets or glasses even that allow you to do this stuff. So the whole premise of the piece really is very much sort of with a sort of the metaverse in mind, I think, or extended reality, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
virtual reality. I mean, it could be all those things combined, really. I think you might have something like we're wearing now in the future. It's got down to that size.
It's normally got a heads up.
I mean, it's got to be really. We're going to have to be several generations ahead in terms of chip technology and other things, obviously. But it's got down to this sort of size, batteries, and you have access to not only a metaverse where you wouldn't want to be wandering down the road because you'd end up getting run over by a bus while you're in it, but you could do. But I think you could do the metaverse at home and extended and AR, let's say, when you're outside and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it's clear to see that whoever make the best hardware, then developers will flock to that. You know, most developers do iOS stuff.
Yeah, that stands to reason, and that's obviously happened while we've got a duopoly in games consoles, for example. But to bring it back, and I'm going to wrap it up soon, because I've a personal incentive after all the beers I've drank to wrap it up soon. The question about kids. So I know from this...
I think it's inevitable.
And I'm sure... Yeah, it's inevitable. And I know from this that most parents, and myself included, have some degree of conscience and shame because it's so easy with our kids, especially when they were younger, if you need to shut them up, just lob a phone or a tablet at them. And I've done it. And my kids have spent their lives fucking around on YouTube, and I haven't got a clue what they look at on YouTube. I kind of trust that the filters and the censorship on YouTube is of a high enough level that they're not going to see anything properly dodgy. But they could be seeing all kinds of stuff.
Like a hemorrhoid operation. You're like, whoa, that's on YouTube.
Well, yeah, anything. I mean, sometimes I hear my daughter pissing herself laughing, and I think, I hope this is wholesome shit she's laughing at. So I suppose this is an extension of that, really. But there's never been a kids' internet. I mean, there's like a kids' YouTube and there's a kids' Netflix and that sort of thing. But there's never been a kids' internet. So just to go full circle back to the thing that unnerves me about this...
At the router level.
Yeah, when people talk about a kids' metaverse, and just looking at the story, they hadn't really fleshed it out, but what they had done is stressed how really, really safe it's going to be. And to me, every time someone starts going on about... Like, have you ever seen on TV... all the ads for like gambling, for like bookies and gambling, they're always about how safe it is and how, or you don't want to bet too much, no, you'll be fine. And I always think, well, that's bullshit.
Gamble responsibly.
So they get Ray Winston to do it?
Yeah, they get Ray Winston to go, don't fucking splash all your cash. There. You map it.
You have to, where's my money?
Yeah, where's my money? And then, but that always makes me think, well, I just think the opposite. When they say we really care about you not bankrupting yourself and gambling, what they're really saying is we fucking hope you do, but we've got to say that we don't. And so when you get Lego and Epic Games come out with something where there's no substance to it, but they keep stressing how super safe it'll be for kids, it just makes you think,
It's like the airline pilot out of the blue just going... Ladies and gentlemen, there's absolutely no concern.
Yeah, exactly.
No need to be concerned.
We're definitely not going to crash in the next few minutes.
Why did he say that?
Exactly. So I think, and I'm not accusing, obviously, Lego and Epic of anything, and I'm sure you could produce a perfectly wholesome one, and if you did it right, parents would buy into it, they feel they got the safeguards, that maybe there'd be an alert system on your phone, where if your kid tried to enter a space that was... not age delineated as you wanted.
I think it's at the App Store level. You would only install kids-friendly apps on the headset.
Yeah.
And whenever they want to buy something, they need your.
So there would need to be control, but it needs to be very age graded because your kids are still at a sort of preschool, primary school level. Mine at secondary school level. Things can change quite rapidly over the course of a year or two of what they're capable of handling. And so I think that's what it comes down to, is controls. If you get like a parental control panel, like there's one app we use, which isn't actually designed primarily for spying on your kids, but that's what we use it for. It's called something like Life 360 or something like that. And basically it's just a really simple app where whoever's registered on it, you can see wherever their phone is at a given time, which presumably is where the person is.
Oh, it's like Find My Phone on Apple? Right.
So we can see when our kids are arrived at school. We can see if Jack goes out with his mates. We can see if he's on his way home, and all that sort of thing. I think if we're going to get into the kiddie side of things, and unless you've got anything to say, Ian, I'll wrap it up there. If they really want to reassure parents, it's about giving us loads of controls. I never felt I had as many controls as ideally should have. I'll admit to deficiencies and laziness on my part of just chucking a device at them because it shuts them up. Just like I used to call lollipops when they were kids, I used to call them shut up on a stick. Kid would be moaning, give him a lollipop, suddenly, silence. Anyone who's not a parent can't understand quite what you'll do to shut a kid up. But anyway, I would like, in hindsight, to have had some kind of console, some kind of grand unifying app on my phone or cluster of apps where I could just check in. I'm not going to spy on them the whole time. I've got stuff to do. But just check in every now and then and go, oh, Jack, I noticed you went there the other day. I told you not to go there. If you do it again, I'll let your phone off you.
Yeah, look at the history on the video.
Exactly. So I think if people like Epic and Lego want to create a metaverse for kids and they really want it to be as safe as they say, they actually need to empower parents, was what I would say. All right, cool. I'm going to wrap it up there. And you guys have all got shit to do anyway. So I will just say thanks a lot for listening and make sure you join us for the next one.